Hello and welcome everyone to the main event. My name is Mita Sani and I'm really pleased to be joined by Detola Amure, our special guest today. Hi, Detola.
Hi, Meta. It's really lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure and I'm glad you're in the room because we need an expert on grief, and this is Grief Awareness Week, is that right?
Yes, it is. It's National Grief Awareness Week. So from the 2nd to the 9th, this week is more about, creating awareness around grief. Yeah.
And is that specifically in the workplace, or is it just in the world? Like, what is the purpose of a week like this?
So it's the purpose of a week like this really is just to create more awareness on this overlooked subject. As we know, grief impacts everyone, but when we don't talk about it, we are not taught how to deal with grief when it happens. But the sad truth is that every single one of us is going to experience loss in one way or the other. So
Yeah.
this week really is about creating that awareness for everyone in the world, not just in the workplace,
Yeah.
to know how to deal with grief when it comes. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. And actually, I think that if we were better equipped to deal with it in our day-to-day lives, the chances are that that would filter through to the workplace anyway. But
Exactly.
I personally have lost both my parents in the last 10 years, and both were very different. I didn't realize that grief for one parent would be so different for my other parents. So last year when I lost my mother, I didn't expect to have half the symptoms I did and didn't recognize myself. So I can speak from my own experience that we think, even if we are very aware of it, we don't always have all the answers. So a good session today. Thank you for everyone who signed up. Thank you for taking that time out and making this an important topic. When you look at some of the statistics around grief and the impact it has, and specifically talking about the workplace, and on average, each person who experiences intense grief can take up to 22 days off from work in their first 6 months. And 5% of people actually leave their jobs after 6 months if they're experiencing grief, deep and intense grief. So this topic is so important. Now, before we jump into it, Detola, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So while everyone's jumping in, just wanted to bring your attention to the chat room. This is 45-minute session. We want to run till about 1:45. We know that you will give up your time, but that you also want to go away with something that you can apply into your organizations and share with your fellow teammates straight away and create a positive impact. So we aim to have this for about 45 minutes. And we have a chat box, which is really easy to navigate. I'm literally going to type a quick hello in there just to show you all how easy it is. So please give us a hi, let us know you can hear us. And if you have anything specific that you'd like to cover today or any comments and questions, please pop them in the chat box. The more specific that we can make this session for you, the more useful it's going to be. And that's what our aim is today, to give everyone tools to go away with. What I'll also just draw your attention to is a poll. So every time we run our main events, we like to get a temperature of the room. And so today our poll is all around what areas of support you feel you need that will help you manage grief in the workplace, whether that's you handling it or teaching your managers, or if you're responsible for a team, how everyone can be upskilled. So the first option is recognizing the signs, and this is something that you and I are going to cover, Detola. Making special adjustments, so how you would adjust and manage somebody's environment to support that journey. Upskilling management, so do managers have the tools? And the next one being communication, that's also an element of upskilling. Does somebody have the language and the ability to create a safe space for somebody going through grief? Access to resources is another option. And then we've got the other option there. So if there's something that we haven't put in the poll options, but it's something that you feel you would like to cover, please put those comments into the chat box. And we're already getting some hellos. So thank you, everyone. We appreciate it. It allows us to make it very specific for you. And let's get going, Detola. So, right, we've got a few areas that we're going to cover today. We're going to be talking about what the signs are, the cost of not dealing with grief, so the impact, and we already mentioned people leave, so that's going to be quite, I think, a shock to an employer that actually somebody that was absolutely fine at one point, all of a sudden through no reason for the around work will walk out the door with all of those skills, knowledge, ability, team involvement. We're then going to think about and discuss specifically practical strategies such as listening techniques and how to create that safe space for staff, upskilling management, and also special adjustments. So we've got a big topic to get through, big sections to get through today. Where would we start, Detola? What would be the first sign that, I suppose what we should start with is talking about the types of grief that are out there, because it's not just the death of a parent, as I mentioned. Grief can come in many forms, right?
Yeah, totally. So most times when people hear the word grief, the first thing that comes to mind is someone has died or it's a bereavement. And largely that is what grief is. But grief is beyond that. Grief is when there's an end of or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. So if you think of a divorce, for example, or even the loss of a job, redundancy, health challenges, there's an element of grief that comes into play. And so that you can almost divide losses into two: tangible and intangible losses. So the tangible losses are some of the ones I've mentioned: death, a divorce or end of a relationship, loss of a pet, things like that, health challenges, financial challenges. And then we have things like intangible losses, where you could have something like loss of trust, loss of safety. When COVID happened, everyone had that loss. We safety measures. Everyone was, panicking.
And that's
right?
a form of grief, you would say.
That's a form of grief. That's a form of grief, because once there's an end of or change in a familiar pattern, grief is likely to happen because there's a change which you probably didn't expect. And when you have things like loss of dreams, hopes, and expectation as well, that can evoke grief. So there is quite, in fact, there are about 60 life events that can evoke the emotion of grief. So it's quite huge. Yeah, it's beyond bereavement. There's a whole lot more, just like I've said. Yeah.
Okay. And we referred to it in our invitation as the silent crisis. That's a really powerful phrase. Why do you think grief is so overlooked and misunderstood in the workplace?
I think it's overlooked because it's an invisible experience. So even though it's something huge that has happened, unlike a physical illness, grief isn't something you wear on your face and say, I am grieving, right? It comes with, it doesn't have clear outward signs. And so many people, leaders in the workplace, managers, might be uncomfortable addressing grief due to the lack of fear of what to say, or you don't want to say the wrong thing, you don't want to step on someone's toes, so you end up ignoring it altogether. But that's not the right way to go. There's also this cultural tendency that expect people to just move on from that event. But that's not the case, because grief is unique. And just like you rightly said, you had a different experience when your mom passed away, and I'm so sorry to hear about your loss. When your mom passed away compared to when your dad passed away. And that's because you had different relationships with both your dad and your mom, right? So there's no linear way to grieve. So I guess it's overlooked because we just don't know what to say or how to deal with it.
And I think that people, if they have experienced it, will usually use their own experiences and reflect on that when they're supporting somebody else, which isn't necessarily the right thing to do.
No, it's not.
My own experience are two completely different. And then you have those that haven't experienced deep grief, and therefore the ability to support and empathize becomes almost impossible, because it's intangible, like we said. It's not like where we feel unwell, or everyone's had a time when they're not feeling 100%, but grief, and the fact that you said it's not just bereavement. We really sadly had somebody lose their pet yesterday, and today they asked if they want to work to keep busy, but they want to do as few face-to-face meetings, and it was like, yeah, absolutely. Pets is such a contentious one, because again, it's that not people who haven't got that connection just don't know what it's like. So it's having empathy, isn't it? I think starting like the baseline for managing grief, whether it's tangible or intangible bereavement, right through to loss of safety, like you mentioned in COVID, it starts with finding a way to have compassion. Now, again, some people have really high EQ and are able to manifest that, and others are very black and white. So if we were to go out and sort of have a starting point, how would what would be the blueprint of manifestation of grief? So if somebody wasn't naturally able to notice, what would the signs be that somebody is looking for to support grief, that they can see that somebody's grieving?
Yeah, so you're so right. We all grieve differently, and it could be as a result of our culture. Some cultures allow outward expression of grief, while some don't. And also our belief system also comes into play. So it's very possible that someone is grieving and they don't show it physically, but they're usually signs. Now, again, like I said, we all grieve differently, but some of the signs that can show that someone is grieving is when their performance at work drops. There might be, different reasons could cause that, but when you begin to notice that the performance has dropped, that is a sign. When someone is present at work physically, but then they are making mistakes. They didn't used to make mistakes before. Now they are making mistakes. They are a little bit more forgetful, or maybe there's an unexplained emotional outburst. That could be a sign of grief. Other signs could be things like they are disengaged. They are not. Maybe they used to be very jovial, but now they're just withdrawn. They're irritable. Those are some signs. So at least ask the question, what's going on? Because not everyone's gonna. We have this idea that you drop your personal problems at the door, but the truth is that our personal issues still follow us to the workplace.
We are multi-dimensional human beings, and one of the things that I talk about more and more and try and live by more and more, especially management training, is let's treat our employees as multi-dimensional people. They are not just someone at work who wants to further their career. They absolutely are that. And they're a family person, and they're on their own personal growth journey, if we're just picking 3 elements. And I think it's an employer's responsibility to holistically understand and support all those areas, because they all feed into each other and help that person be better in all areas. And loyalty, and I think I'll probably repeat this whatever topic we cover, but actually the loyalty and appreciation you get back, and therefore engagement and productivity, it's infinite. It's really powerful.
Totally. And sometimes you might have someone who is working so hard, they don't want to go home because they don't want to think about what's happening. And so it appears that they are more high performing, but that could be a mask of something else going on. So there are various signs. What
would you say are some of the misconceptions about grief in the workplace, and what makes leaders and colleagues miss when someone's grieving?
So like I said before, sometimes leaders and managers could have this impression that grief is personal and should not impact your work, or leave your personal issues at the door. So that is a misconception, saying don't bring your personal issues to work. Now, of course, no one is saying bring all your issues to work, but the truth is grief impacts us personally and professionally. So there's no way you can leave grief at the door, if you see what I mean. Another misconception is that, they'll be fine, they'll get over it quick, that they'll be okay. And especially if you haven't gone through a similar loss, you think, this person should be fine. Or maybe 1 year down the line, maybe the anniversary of someone's death, they are not doing well that day, and you're like, are they still not okay? Those kind of things, thinking that time will heal their wounds. And that is not true. Time doesn't do much really on its own. Or you expect that. Sorry, go on. You wanted to say something?
No, I was just going to say, we've actually got a comment from Danielle who says that your comments are really resonating about overperforming and masking her grief, and I think what you said about grief not being linear, and therefore on anniversaries, recognizing that somebody could again be right back to day one. So one of the challenges that I think a lot of organizations have is time and awareness, right? Where everyone's so busy, everyone's getting on with it, but that they might not even have that structure where they have that one-to-one time with their employee or a colleague to say, how are you? you know, and if you don't have that time, I would say start by making sure every one-to-one has that element, ideally at the start, which checks in on a human level
Exactly.
before anything else.
Totally.
You have a business that actually supports organizations and individuals. It's called a productivity company.
Yeah.
And from the statistics around the impact of grief, the high percentage of people leaving, the number of sickness days, just the lack of engagement, what would you say has been your success story in how you've helped organizations and people?
So yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking that question. So one thing we do at the productivity company is on two levels. We work with the organizations to basically help them be more grief sensitive and more grief aware. So that's on one hand, training managers on the things, signs to look out for and the things to say. And then on the other hand, we also work with individuals as well, who maybe through their organization or they come to us by, individually by themselves.
Yeah.
And we do that through our 8-week grief resolution program.
Okay.
And one of the, I would like to share one of the success stories we had recently of a lady. I'll call her Sarah. That's not her real name, but I'll just call her Sarah. I remember when she came to us, she was at a very low point in her life. She had endured an abusive relationship, pregnancy loss, and then she now got divorced after 24 years of marriage. So you can just imagine, a little bit of what she went through. And I remember when she came to us, one thing she had said was that she had gone through her employee assistant program, which helped, but didn't quite address some of the deep pain she was going through and some of her unresolved grief. And when she joined our program, initially she struggled because it was emotionally tough being able to, bring up repressed emotions and memories, but she persisted. And towards the end, to the final weeks, she suddenly had a great breakthrough where she described it as feeling unburdened with all of the unresolved grief that she had been carrying. Yeah. And one way, some of the ways she said, some of the things she noticed, in fact, I think it was week 7, she said she hadn't been able to sleep straight through the night. And she had the best sleep ever. That was just joy to my, like music to my ears to hear that. She said she had a full night rest. And then even her work, it had affected her work. She couldn't focus properly. But after going through the program, she was able to regain focus and, regain her energy.
Yeah.
And I just had a chat with her recently. And so that she did a program 10 months ago.
Okay.
And she was telling me that still feeling, energized. She hasn't relapsed. And that is why we do what we do. We want to make sure that people are not stuck in their grief.
Yeah.
Because there's this myth that I can never get over this. You can't. Yeah. You can't get over the unresolved pain. Yeah. Yes, you're gonna miss your loved one. You might be sad on the anniversaries, but what we want to help you resolve is the pain attached to that. That loss. So I have lots of stories, but I'll stop there.
And also, if it's not a bereavement loss, but it could be a loss of an opportunity, a career opportunity. Yes. It's what I call the bounce back ability. It's that resilience to be able to say, okay, that happened.
Yeah.
Being able to process it, as you said, not carry the burden and the weight of that, and therefore be able to look ahead, not behind. Mm-hmm. And a course like that obviously is a financial investment, but it's comparing the cost of a course against the cost of not investing in grief support. I mean, the cost of getting it wrong is huge. Tell me a little bit about what the impact of not addressing grief could be on an organization.
Oh, wow. It's huge. And I guess people, maybe because we don't, how when organizations are looking at their cost, they might not realize that grief has an impact.
Yeah.
And so if you think about someone who is going through grief and they're constantly absent from work, that again, lots of sick days, right, due to emotional and physical effects of grief. So that's on one hand. Yeah. Then that you might have higher turnover rates. You gave the stats earlier. When people feel unsupported at work, they would end up leaving. and this would increase your recruitment and training costs.
Well, I can talk about that. I mean, I tell you what, the number of organizations we work with where they've had somebody who has dealt with grief, but because it wasn't processed properly or supported properly, that person has talked with their feet and left.
Yeah.
And what's happened is that the cost of replacement is not just the recruitment fee, not just the time of interviewing and shortlisting CVs, but actually the cumulative cost of replacing somebody's role is 3 to 5 times annual salary. Also, the intangible cost, I would say, is colleagues watching how a member of the team has been supported. Because if they're not supported right, those colleagues will also then talk with their feet. And then it becomes a really costly and avoidable mistake.
Yes, and that was the next point I was going to raise. If an organization, the managers, the leaders are not empathetic, it will lower the morale of the other staff, right? It would the engagements to be reduced, and it can even harm the employer's reputation out there. If you're not known to be people who care about your staff, it's going to impact your reputation as an organization.
I think,
and of course,
no, please.
No, I was just going to say the one more point, which is again team disruption. If grief isn't managed properly, it's going to affect the communication in the team, the collaboration, and also the bottom line is going to be affected. There is going to be lots of money which the business is going to lose, and it could even be up to billions of pounds or dollars, depending on where you are. When it comes to productivity and turnover. So it's a huge cost. Yeah, it
is. And the only point I was going to add is that, we all turn up, whether we're managers, leaders, or even employees, we want to be part of an organization that is an employer of choice, that people want to be part of. And every employee, this is something we work with our clients a lot on, is how to present yourself as an employer of choice, best in class, and for every employee of an organization to be a brand ambassador. Now, if an employee sees their colleagues or themselves has an experience of not being supported through a grief process, they can hardly authentically be a brand ambassador and talk about their organization as an employer of choice. So those intangible costs are probably the most expensive.
Exactly.
Just looking at the chat box, actually, Marcus says that he can relate to the invisibility and dealing with the invisibility of long-term trauma in the workplace being a real challenge. I would actually say that I think when it's undealt with or unsupported, I think the weight of that trauma gets heavier over the years. Actually,
it sure does.
You get tired as well. So not only do you have the trauma, but the individual carrying the trauma can feel weary. And so the impact of it actually intensifies and grows. So well done, everyone who's come along today. One thing I would say, actually, and I didn't mention, was that we send this recording along to you at the end of the day. So if you haven't made notes or there's things that, you want to look back on, you'll have this recording. I would also say that if you've got members of your team, managers or senior leadership that you want to show why this is an important topic and worth time and maybe financial investment into, get them to watch this. They can watch it on double time on YouTube. So, a small commitment will hopefully give you a lot of value back to your organization. So Detola, that brings us on to the next area, which is talking about practical strategies of dealing and supporting grief. So we mentioned in the invitation listening techniques, creating safe spaces. Where would an organization start with thinking about what practical strategies to put in place?
So I think the first thing an organization needs to do is it needs to be part of their culture, where they become more grief sensitive and more grief aware. We cannot sweep this under the carpet anymore, because every single one of us is going to be affected, whether we like it or not, sooner or later. And it's about approaching grief with empathy. Empathy is so key when it comes to dealing with grief in the workplace, or not just in the workplace, anywhere. We must be able to, managers, I know managers are busy and overworked, but I think when we lead with empathy, it helps to frame, your perspective. And so if managers can create a safe space for the grieving employee to share their needs.
Yeah.
And it's about asking open-ended questions, Obviously, like I said, we train managers as well on how to go about this whole thing. So simple questions like, how can we best support you during this time? Right? Now, sometimes the griever might not know how they want to be supported, but at least by opening up that conversation, it helps them to think about, okay, how would I like to be supported during this time of grief? And then it's also about providing flexibility, whether it's about adjusting workloads, schedules, or deadlines, because the truth is something has happened, and if we don't address it the right way, the proper way, that employee might end up leaving. So it's about saying, okay, there's a change here, something has impacted our staff. How do we show up for them? Saying that I love the word you used earlier, being loyal to our staff members. It's also about communicating clearly with the team members what has happened. And I guess it also depends on how much the griever is willing to share.
Getting their permission.
Exactly, getting their permission, letting the griever lead. And also managers need to begin to familiarize themselves with available resources. What is the policy around bereavement? And in fact, this is now for the wider organization. I think every organization needs to check that their grief policies, not just bereavement, because remember, it's not just about someone dying, it's about different type of losses. How flexible is it? Does it take into consideration different diverse ways that people will grieve? So for example, we have cultures where maybe the parents live abroad and there's this whole ceremony of how long you need to be away. Do we take into account all of those things? You can't just put one
size fits
one size fits all and say you only have 2 days off. That's not going to work in some situations. 2 days is not going to cut it, right? So it's things like that.
So a bereavement policy is important to have. Not bereavement, sorry. A grief policy is important to have. Within that, there might be where we give some days for bereavement. There may be days. However, a manager should also consider the individual's heritage, cultural background, and these don't have to be paid. You can keep it safe. You can agree to having a paid day for bereavement or 2 or whatever your policy is, and then perhaps agreeing some unpaid leave. Sometimes it's not about the financial, it's about giving people time. So I always think as well that the answer is in the employee. If we create that safe space to let them open up, they will tell you what they need. And sometimes we can't do it all either as employers. We're afraid to offer because we think, oh no, we're not going to be able to give. But we can look at something that works together to be able to. So I think moving it along from where it is in black and white as a policy, which might be enough, but if it isn't, understanding why and then trying to match that person's needs and being on that journey with them, I think is the biggest service you can do somebody. They feel listened to, they feel supported, they feel heard. And again, I think what you get back as an employer, the loyalty back is just infinitesimal. Just got a few comments that I want to bring up while we're talking. Ammonia speaks about that they work in the health sector and saying that many people don't even realize that what they're feeling is grief. So and that's so common. So she, really appreciates us addressing that. Marcus talks about the fact that retaining a troubled colleague might not necessarily be a good thing. He speaks about his own journey of leaving and pursuing gentler paths, which was right for him. And that retaining would have actually been harder for him. It would have only amplified his grief. So it's having those sensitive, open, honest conversations, which, you leave positive footprints, right? It allows everyone to not create even more damage, which is the word that Marcus used.
Can I say something to that point that Marcus raised? And I think it's such a valid point where you don't want to retain a troubled colleague. But one other thing I was going to say about that is, if we can begin to have signpost them to organizations like TP, the Productivity Company, where we work with the griever over 8 weeks. And we've had success stories of people who, when they come along, they're just not in a good place. But afterwards, they are they've resolved the pain around their losses. So it doesn't have to be TPC. It could be another organization where they've been trained. They have grief specialists who can help the troubled colleague, walk through that loss. So that way it ends up being a win-win where the troubled colleague has now gone through some therapy of some sort. And, they're, like you said, they're like, wow, this is great. I'm happy to come back to work. But I totally get Marcus' point about if the person isn't just in that place, so, and again, because we all grieve differently and at different times, the person might just not be ready to walk through their loss at that point. Yes, at that point, it might be like you said, case of having that gentle conversation of exiting them out. Yeah.
And organizations have sabbaticals, they have unpaid leave. There's so many situations outside of grief where organizations do create space. Perhaps it can be a sabbatical, but it could be triggered by a requirement because of grief. Let's be creative and let's think about what the outcome is, and then work together to see what tools you have as an organization that can support somebody achieve what they want to achieve. Sometimes they might think they need longer and say, hey, actually, it's been 3 months, I'm feeling really good, I'd like to consider returning. One of the things as well that I wanted to just cover off with you is around a little bit more detail is the communication. So we spoke about the open questions. If somebody doesn't even realize they're grieving on their own, how can a manager or a leader approach it without crossing that line that they're uncomfortable to cross? What if they don't know they're grieving, and it could be just that they notice a change in their behavior or their productivity, what would a good open question be as a starting point? Could be their one-to-one, and the manager wants to sort of just bring up the topic.
Wow, that's such a fantastic question. And you're right, someone might not even know they're grieving. They don't even know that this is what is going on with them. I think once we're able to create an environment within the workplace where people know they're not going to be judged, and it almost feels like there needs to be a whole revamp of a lot of organizations, especially when it comes to empathy, right? We don't want to wait to a situation where there's now a problem, but an employee doesn't feel safe enough to share, right? So that's why I said, sometimes organization, we need to check that our culture is one where empathy rules. So, even if the manager can't seem to get through, maybe find someone within the team who they trust to say, what, I've noticed that this person's performance has dropped. Have a chat with them, because they might not want to talk to the manager, they might feel like they're going to be judged or they might be sanctioned or whatever. Or maybe there's someone in the team or someone in HR who can have that conversation with them to just say, what's going on with you? I just wanted to check in, And in fact, I remember one case of someone who, very high performer, and suddenly his performance started dropping. It wasn't so noticeable, but one of the HR members kind of noticed and got someone on his team to just check in. It so happened that he was having troubles at home. The wife was threatening to divorce and all of that. So even though this was on the very early stages of what would have turned out to be something really awful, they caught it early at work, and were able to coach him. They got him a coach. They got him a grief specialist on our team to support him, and that kind of quickly resolved things. So I guess it's about noticing and just saying, okay, even if a manager can't get through that to that person, hopefully there's someone on the team that they're friends with or that they get along with. If it involves getting a pair to talk to them, then the organization needs to do whatever they need to do. And it's also about listening, like you rightly pointed out before, listening without judgment. It's so easy to judge. It's so easy to think we can fix people's problems. People don't need fixing. They just need to be heard.
So
grievers don't
listening
need
without judgment and listening initially without solution. So rather than just saying, well, you could do this and you could do that, actually just hold space for somebody to let it out. And you don't have to have the answers. You can literally say, thank you for sharing that.
For sure, yeah.
This is really important. I'd like to take some time to reflect on what you've said so I can come back with the right ways or right options that we can talk about to support you. So you don't have to have all the answers at your fingertips. And I think often managers are afraid to address a topic where they think they might be caught out or unprepared. So go in with the intention of just gaining understanding.
Yes. And going with being empathetic and not avoiding the situation. I think that's another huge thing where, because we're not sure what to say, we then avoid, and that just complicates matters. It complicates matters.
So interestingly, just looked at the poll to see what the scores are at the moment, and the leading area of support is around making those special adjustments. The next three are all equal: recognizing the signs, upskilling management, and improving communication skills. And actually, it seems like the room are aware of the resources out there, because that's the lowest score. So that's good. If we were going to go from a conversation to going away and thinking about it, what would the special adjustments look like for an employee that needed support?
So I guess it would, there was something you said earlier about you might have a broader policy, but then it's still looking at each person's individual case, right? So there are things we need to consider, like the cultural element. If someone needs to travel abroad for a funeral, as an example, or maybe it's a divorce has happened, what are some of this? And I guess this is where HR and consultants need to come into a room to discuss what are some of the special adjustments. It could be, flexible working hours, right? Or maybe they're going to be working from home for a few months, or whatever it is that would help the team.
Yeah, just like a member of my team said, can I have a few days where I'm not physically face to face, but I can do on the telephone? Like, just that's such a small thing. And yet I'm sure for that individual asking, it was probably really hard to ask, because nobody wants to seem to not being able to cope, but that's just natural. And actually, the more we're supported, the less heavy the weight of that pain and burden is. The other thing actually that is available that we often forget is, as you mentioned, around the policies, but also the EAP, but also, a lot of companies offer private medical. The private medical service has psychologists and grief support as part of their additional rewards and benefits. A lot of them have access to mental health apps, which have special meditations around grief, and even workplace stress. Like, there's so many different ways that you've already paid for as an organization, but you might not have brought to life for your people. So make sure you don't treat it like wallpaper, but actually really always check that you're utilizing and shouting about the way that your members of the team can get support, because it could be, we're talking about grief today, but it could be other reasons they're stressed as well. There's so many tools that I think are underutilized that companies have already paid for. Going into the last area of our conversation today, Detola, I wanted to ask, what do you think that employees should be doing to advocate for themselves? Now, there are lots of organizations where they might actually be really good, but if they're not, if everyone's heads down, stress, year end, target, and there's an employee sitting with grief, what are the steps that an employee could take to be able to advocate for themselves?
So thank you for that question. One thing, the first thing I will say is that anyone who's grieving should realize and should acknowledge their grief and the impact it is having on them. Because until you acknowledge that you are grieving and that there's been an impact, you'll still want to show up like you usually do, but find that you're struggling. And then that suddenly becomes a thing on its own, where like, why am I not showing up the way I should? And then you begin to feel guilty that you're not able to, do your work the way you should. And doubting yourself. But you need to acknowledge that something huge has happened, right? Whether anyone else acknowledges it or not, acknowledge it first and say, something huge has happened, right? And it's okay not to have all the answers on how your work can support you, but communication is key. Communication is key. If, for example, you find that you are not feeling well in yourself because again, grief impacts us physically. If your GP has signed you off work, or you're not just able to show up to work, communicate. Don't just ghost your employer, you know, open up and say, this is what has happened, as much as you want to share, or as little as you want to share, but allow them to, you know, give them the opportunity to know what's happening with you. It's also about, you know, identifying people you trust in the workplace who you can share a whole lot more with as much as you want. And it's also about asking for help, because asking for help is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of strength.
Yes.
You know, taking ownership of your healing journey or your grief journey also means opening up to the resources available to you. And it's good to know that, you know, a number of employers have, you know, resources within the organization. And then use external support. If you need external support, ask your employer to pay for external help if that's the route you want to go. We've had clients come to us privately and have asked their organizations to pay, and they were happy to pay, because it could be like Sarah, who I mentioned earlier, the EAP didn't quite work for her, or this didn't quite work. Keep researching, ask around. I need help, because if you think it's going to go away by itself, it's not going to go away by itself.
It's as you said, it's not linear as well. So it could be that an employee has had grief, has you know, experienced grief, and actually they might be feeling all right for a couple of months. They might be thinking, hey, you know, I'm okay. Maybe they're in avoidance mode. But if they are able to explain that I'm actually all right now, but I may not be in the future.
I mean, exactly.
Can we, you know, have it as an item on my weekly agenda that we check in on? That way they don't think, oh, well, I was fine and now I'm not. How is my boss going to respond to that? You know? So it's communication is such, I mean, I feel that every aspect of successful organization starts and finishes with communication. Give me an example of where an employer's got it really wrong, because, you know, as much as we all want to set out with the best intentions of getting it right, what would getting it really wrong look like?
Getting it really wrong will look like someone who has, let's say someone called, I don't want to use any name on there.
No.
Dave. Tell me there's no Dave on there.
No Dave. Not so
no Dave. Well, no Dave has said, you know.
You've got no Dave
So Dave has gone through, actually, no, I'll change that. Let's change that to film, because I'm quite familiar with this story. Someone who went off to have a baby, and this happened to a personal client of mine. Went off to have a baby, but then she had a stillbirth. And so she had informed her manager, and manager like, oh, okay, you know, she had kind of sent a message or something to say this had happened. But because the manager didn't have the tools, didn't know what to say, basically informed the team, oh, you know, let's not upset her, so don't say anything to her. So that was the approach they took. And so she comes back to work, and everyone's like, you know, like just
pretending it didn't happen.
Say anything, pretend that this didn't happen. And that was like a shock. Like, how would her team members, who knew she went away pregnant, but she had informed the manager, is now back, and no one said anything? Maybe one person here or there said something, but her team didn't say anything. And that really shook her, because, you know, what the truth is, we spend 1/3 of our time at work. And so this is a place where you spend a lot of time, and no one is acknowledging what has happened to you. That took a lot, right? It took a lot from her, and she was angry. And you can just imagine how that went it just spiraled out. So I think where employees can get it wrong is when you don't acknowledge what has happened. It's simple. Oh my goodness, I heard what happened. I'm so sorry. I can't imagine how you feel, or I can't imagine how that must feel. That simple statement can go a long way. By acknowledging someone's grief, it would go a long way, rather than ignoring.
Sorry for your loss.
Oh yes, sorry for your loss. You don't have to say more than that. You can say, I'm here when you need me. But ignoring it is a no. That is you getting it totally wrong.
And as we're tying up today's session, I can't believe it's already been 45 minutes.
I know.
What would the takeaway be that you want everyone who's watching live now, listening live now, or, you know, listening to a recording later down the line? What would you want the message takeaway message to be for people that this subject is important to?
I think my takeaway to employers listening or even employees listening is that grief isn't just a personal experience, it's a workplace issue as well. And acknowledging grief in the workplace isn't just about compassion, it's about creating an environment where people feel seen, where people feel supported and empowered to heal while remaining engaged. And it's about finding that balance. It's about allowing open communication and providing practical support for that employee. I keep mixing up my employee and employee.
Right, that's okay.
About the employee. It's
Yeah.
also about normalizing the conversation around grief, whether
Yes.
it's having grief hubs in the workplace, normalizing the conversation. Let's not make this thing, let's not, mystify grief. Let's demystify it. It happens to every single one of us.
It's
So
happening all
let's
the
find a
time.
way, where we can we can normalize the conversation around grief.
Yeah.
Because when we create workplaces that are empathetic, it would increase people's productivity and help them to be more resilient. It doesn't have to be the silent crisis anymore. And we're here to
Give it a
support.
voice.
We have links to share as well. I think
Thank
maybe when the recording goes out, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, we'll share the links with everyone with the recording, which will go out at the end of the day. And Detola, thank you so very much. I mean, gosh, it's given me goosebumps actually talking this through with you, because as much as we think we know how to deal with it, there's always more improved and empathetic ways that an employer can support their employees. And I think what you said about employees advocating for themselves as well, it's a two-way street, right? So let's create that safe space, and let's keep talking, and let's create that success, happiness, engagement, and productivity together. That's what it's all about.
Yes.
Okay, well, I'm going to just do a little end on the poll, which in the end, the top scores were recognising the signs and making special adjustments. So hopefully Detola and I have covered off some of that for you today. We'll also be sending contact details for both Detola and I. So if there's something that we haven't covered today, please reach out. We're on LinkedIn. You'll have our numbers. You're not alone. We'll get through this together. And on that note, I'm going to say thank you so much, Detola. Thank you, everyone. And
thank you, Mita. Thank you for the opportunity.
Pleasure. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.